Welcome to this car seat. Today we are going to talk about a topic which is central to contemporary debates in economic regulation, at least in the UK, namely customer engagement. So today we are talking to Dr. Eva Heims, LSE Fellow here in the Government Department, but also CARR Research Associate. Eva, so customer engagement is sort of a central topic. Many people say it has to do with the wider crisis in regulation, debates about accountability and transparency. How does it fit into these debates about accountability?
Well, at first sight, I think you could think that customer engagement in regulation could solve all of our problems when it comes to accountability, when it comes to legitimacy in regulation, because you think we're directly talking to the people who are actually affected by businesses' decisions and by regulators' decisions. So it sounds great, and I think we need to take that potential very seriously. But as soon as you engage customers in regulatory processes, you open a whole new can of worms, if you will, of legitimacy and accountability issues. For example, if you get together a group of customers, why are they representative of customers at large? Very tricky question. So far, often customer groups in regulation are not meant to be representative. They're meant to use customer research to represent what customers want. But of course, customer research finds it very difficult to make complex trade-offs that individual customers would be willing to make or would not be willing to make these trade-offs. So you all of a sudden have that sort of issue in the room, I'd say. So we need to be careful not to see this just as a solution to legitimacy and accountability problems, but we also need to look at further issues that it raises.
And how is customer engagement practiced? What is the experience in the different sectors?
Well, here in the UK, sort of the earliest example we saw was in the aviation sector, actually, but since then we've also seen it happening in the energy sector and perhaps most crucially, very recently, in the water sector in England and Wales and in Scotland, which are two different jurisdictions when it comes to regulation. And there in water regulation, we've seen, and this is what makes it so interesting, two different models being practiced in Scotland on the one hand and England and Wales on the other hand. In Scotland, we saw a so-called negotiated settlement. So a customer group actually negotiated a new price for water with the water company, Scottish Water, and that was a customer group that was established from three bodies: the regulator, the water company and the consumer group, to sort of make this new customer body independent from all three entities. In England and Wales, we saw a very different model where the customer group, they called customer challenge groups, were situated at the company level, so belonged to the water companies, if you will, although it was mandated by the economic regulator here in England and Wales. And they didn't directly negotiate a new price. They tried to challenge companies to include results of customer research in their business plans. So we've seen a great variation in models of customer engagement, even just in the UK.
And why on earth is the UK suddenly such an example of customer engagement processes?
Well, where has this come from? I'd say that perhaps the overarching reason is disappointment with existing regulatory models and existing models of consumer representation and regulation. What do I mean when I say existing models of regulation? And disappointment with them. So in utilities regulation, that's, for example, the really well-established RPI-X methodology for conducting price reviews. And regulators sort of felt a sense of disappointment, not because they think this is a bad model that they need to replace, but because it has become very well known by regulators and regulated companies, which makes it much easier to game it for regulated companies, which makes the whole process, regulatory process, sort of predictable. And regulators were looking for a new way to challenge companies and also for a way to improve relationships with regulated companies that sometimes had become a little bit strained, and for a new way to make businesses take ownership of their business plans rather than looking for the regulator to make business decisions for them. But there was also a disappointment among regulators of their ability to represent customers or consumers, which they usually feel they have a responsibility to do, but often felt, for example, that documents they were producing were very complex and it was very hard for, let's say, ordinary people to engage with what the regulator was doing. So they were also looking for new ways of bringing consumers and customers into regulatory processes.
Okay, so it comes out of a disappointment with the past. It happens in many different ways in different areas. So where will it all go? I mean, will sort of 1,000 flowers blossom, or is there one model of customer engagement to emerge? What do you think?
Well, I think the whole idea of customer engagement is probably here to stay, but I don't think that we'll necessarily converge on one model that everyone will use in different sectors. Why is it here to stay? I think that there is a perception amongst regulators, regulated companies, that this has overall so far been a successful experience, not without problems, but regulators feel they were able to challenge companies in a new way, and companies have actually seen it as valuable to talk to their customers directly and become more responsive, for example. So, and there is, of course, the sense that maybe accountability and legitimacy issues and regulation can be somewhat addressed by this model. So here to stay, but not necessarily convergence on the same model, because different sectors and different jurisdictions face very different challenges. For example, when we go back to water regulation in the UK, in Scotland we have one water company that is publicly owned. In England and Wales, during the last price review, we had 18 water companies that are mostly privately owned. So you have shareholders in the room that often want certainty. Introducing customers into the process brings more uncertainty, which is much more difficult if you have privately owned companies. And for a regulator, it's much more difficult to introduce these kinds of new models when you're regulating many companies rather than one. So I think we'll see models of customer engagement emerging and becoming institutionalized that fit the respective contexts of regulation in any particular sector.
And finally, as students of regulation, I mean, what can scholarship about regulation learn from customer engagement? What do you think?
I think scholars of regulation might wonder what is happening here. We are used to a world of regulation over the past few decades, which we often describe as the regulatory state, a model that is very strongly associated with independent, expert, technocratic regulators, if you will, adding customers and their views and their lay knowledge to this process. All of a sudden raises the question of, are we in a different world of regulation now? This is what a regulation scholar might wonder. But I think we shouldn't necessarily think that this has changed everything, because what we have seen in these processes in the UK and customer engagement processes is that if a customer body wants to be able to challenge a company effectively, it usually relies on guidance, expert guidance by economic regulators. So the need for expertise, for technocratic expertise, continues to be there, and regulators continue to supply that, and regulatory processes continue to be based on principles of efficiency, for example. So we're not living in a new world, in a different world of regulation, but I think regulation scholars should take it very seriously, especially the ones that are interested in independence of regulators, accountability in regulation, and also the mapping of regulatory regimes, because all of a sudden we have a new actor in the room, customers and customer groups. So I think regulation scholars will need to start taking this development into account, even though it doesn't represent a fundamental transformation of regulation as we know it.
Eva, thank you very much.
Thank you very much.